From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. Ahead for you today, K-State's Dale Blasi will go over some of the key findings from a recent national survey of stocker cattle operators. It sought information on production and management practices, and it definitely rendered some trends of interest, which Dale will cover in a moment. Then Shelby Varner talks with K-State's Chelsea Arnold about her in-depth study of farm landowners' willingness to lease crop and pasture land to younger agricultural producers who need that rented ground to stay in operation. Chelsea spoke on these findings at the recent K-State Risk and Profit Conference. And later on this week's Wildlife Management segment, K-State's Charlie Lee looks at efforts to control feral swine. All that and more next on Agriculture Today. Thanks for tuning in to Agriculture Today, where first we're going to look ahead to a major event that the Animal Sciences and Industry Department here at K-State stages every year, and it's set for the latter part of September. It's the annual Beef Stocker Field Day here at K-State. And within that program, our main subject here, the results of the latest National Stocker Survey. Filling us in, Dale Blasi, K-State Research and Extension Beef Cattle Specialist, organizer of the Field Day, and one of the co-presenters of this survey information. Dale, let's look at this. This is conducted not every year whatsoever. In fact, it's periodic, this National Stocker Survey. What is it all about?
Well, Eric, back in 2007, myself and 10 other fellow colleagues from land-grant universities from across the country basically got together and assembled a survey instrument to look at about everything that we can think of as it pertains to the stocker segment of our beef industry. And we had a really good outcome from it. We learned a lot from the information. And very recently, sponsored by the Farm Progress Company and sponsored this time by Zoetis Incorporated, actually conducted a similar survey. And so the exciting thing that myself and Wes Ishmael will be presenting at the Field Day are some of the contrast and results that we saw in 2007 and what was very recently reported in the 2020 version.
And this is, if one would get a look at it, a massive set of results. The aim here is to give a sweeping profile of stocker cattle production.
That's right. And, the stocker segment, it's really hard to put your finger on what is going on and where the numbers are. And, of course, the drug companies kill over this information to know where their marketing thrusts need to be. But, from us professionals at the university level, it's important for us to get a good idea of what our producers are doing out there and how we develop educational programs, as well as identify potential research areas that can help this particular segment. But what we found, at least one point from the survey, is how many more cow-calf producers are actually retaining ownership on their cattle and being called backgrounders or stockers, or looking for added opportunities for marketing on as those animals. Instead of selling at weaning, they're perhaps leveraging the value of co-products in the area, their management, and all those other factors.
So that's going up, that number?
Yes, it is increasing. And so, that tells me that perhaps many cow-calf producers are looking at value-added attributes. They're doing intentionally management with their cattle, and they're creating a more homogeneous subset of calves as opposed to our traditional mindset with stocker production, where basically the primary role of the stocker and backgrounder segment was to go through a very diverse population of calves and sort accordingly and create like-sized groups of calves that are ready for placement into our feed yards.
Interesting. You say the age, and this caught your attention, Dale, the age of the stocker operator out there has climbed considerably since the previous survey.
Yes, this was clearly stated in the survey, and who knows, Eric, perhaps the same respondents answered. So we have 13 years to add to the survey. But yes, one of the outcomes of this, one of their questions was that our I think very comparable to what we're seeing in agriculture in general, is we're seeing an aged population of primary producers that are engaged in our industries.
Once more, so much information is included in this survey, but on the stocker calf health management side of it, Dale, what grabbed your attention in specific?
We really haven't seen any significant improvements in morbidity. In fact, that it has gone the other way. And, you know, we use about everything we can on these calves to get them healthy on arrival, and it seems like within the first 90 days from the latest survey, it appears that there's actually been an uptick in the reported incidence of morbidity and even mortality. And of course, as you cross-tap deeper into this survey, there's producers that the younger producers are more risk. They'll accept the risk with more higher-risk cattle. And I don't know if that speaks to the opportunity that they can get into markets and they're willing to take risks with cutter bulls or what have you. And as the producers get older, it seems that they tend to maybe gravitate to the heavier weighted calves that just don't have those health issues that we see with the lighter, perhaps those calves that are fresher off the cow, if you will, and are located with smaller herds in our southeastern states and are marketed through our auction markets, where we get a lot of commingling and a lot of opportunity for calves to get sick.
Well, professionally, something near and dear to you, of course, Dale, is nutritional management. And for stockers, you have talked a number of ideas with producers over the years at the field day. Anything in this survey that, again, caught your eye?
Well, that's right, Eric. And, you know, we've done over the last 5 years a lot of work with limit feeding, and certainly the concept is about as old as I am in terms of people actually implementing this process. But what we saw, what I observed from this survey, is that when compared to 2007, the 2020 results would suggest that a greater percentage of calves were limit fed as opposed to what was done in 2007. Producers reported they utilized almost 20%, utilized more bunk-fed forage for an average of 9 more days. They're just taking advantage, maybe having a closer eye on these calves upon arrival. Maybe that's more of a function of the older producers that are more well capitalized to take advantage of their facilities to start these calves. But from this survey, there are more producers that appear to be approaching their feeding management from a limit feeding perspective.
We're just scratching the surface on what is fully covered in this entire survey, Dale. You, along with Wes Ishmael of Farm Progress Companies, you'll be presenting some of these highlights and more. What do you hope producers can ultimately draw from this effort?
Well, I think it's always interesting to know what your peers are thinking, at least, and certainly into the future. There was some rather interesting outcomes from this latest survey in terms of what they think, what their biggest risk factors are going into the next 5 years.
And you, again, will lead off the Beef Stocker Field Day with a glance to the survey results, and let's talk about the full program. It's set for Thursday, September the 30th at the K-State Beef Stocker Unit to the north and west of the city of Manhattan. In addition to this survey, what else is to be presented there?
Well, Eric, over the last several years, Beef Magazine has sponsored an annual National Beef Stocker Award. You know, in Kansas, we're certainly no shortage of leaders in this particular sector of the industry, and we're fortunate to have Mike Collins from Hamilton, Kansas, and Rich Porter from Redding, Kansas. In addition, we have Dave Steinbecker Jr. from Perryville, Missouri, and John Paul Pendergrass from Charleston, Arkansas will be on this producer panel to basically address what has worked for us and what we see into the future. So it's always good to try to glean as much information as we can from folks that have distinguished themselves in our industry. From our sponsor, this year our sponsor is Huva Pharma. Dr. Joe Diedrichson, one of their tech vets, will talk about how you can manage BRD and coccidiosis effectively with receiving rations for calves coming into the backgrounding yard. We've invited Dr. John Richardson from West Texas A&M University to talk about some of his very novel approaches to starting newly arrived calves on feed. I thought his research would certainly be of interest to our producers to hear his thoughts and to see if potentially they may be able to modify their feeding approaches to what he has to say. So I'm looking forward to hearing his message. And then finally, my colleague, our extension beef veterinarian in the department, Dr. A.J. Tarpoff, he recently completed some research just the first part of this year looking at multiple castration methods in stocker cattle. And Dr. Tarpoff and others in the College of Vet Med took a rather novel approach using thermography to actually measure the healing process and collecting testosterone to quantify the effectiveness of castration. And so I'm very much looking forward to the results of what he has to share with everyone.
It is, once more, a terrific program upcoming on September the 30th, and registrations, Dale, are being received right now.
That's correct. Please go to ksubeef.org, ksubeef.org. Registration is $25 per participant. Before September 15th, we need to get a meal count. That's really why we encourage folks to get registered.
Go to ksubeef.org. Full specifics on the Beef Stocker Field Day, the 22nd annual here at K-State at the Beef Stocker Unit near Manhattan, Thursday, September the 30th, at which you can hear more about this newly released 2021 National Stocker Survey. Dale, thanks for the look at the field day and at that survey today. Appreciate your time.
Thank you, Eric.
Beef cattle specialist Dale Blasi, K-State Research and Extension, with us on Agriculture Today with more for you shortly on this, the K-State Radio Network.
This is Agriculture Today. I'm Shelby Varner, joined today by K-State graduate researcher in agricultural economics, Chelsea Arnold, sharing about a survey that was completed on Kansas landowners. What was that survey, Chelsea?
This survey was sent out to 3,600 landowners across the state of Kansas, and so 3,600 of those were randomly selected from across the state. We sent out a survey that kind of asked demographic questions, asked if you currently lease and what that lease looks like. We asked some risk preferences questions, and then we asked an attitude questions, and then we kind of connected it to young producers and your risk attitudes and preferences towards leasing to a young producer at different costs.
So what are some of those different leases or some of those different factors you truly took into account?
In Kansas, there's three main lease types, really just two. You have fixed cash, which is where either once or twice a year you just simply have agreed upon, say it's $2,000 for the year or however much per acre, and that payment's either made at the beginning of the year, end of the year, but there's no risk in that for a landowner. That's a set income. The only risk they have is the tenant not paying. And then you have a crop share, and that's, from a landowner's perspective, is somewhat a bit more risky because they help pay for some of the inputs, and then at the end of the year they get a percentage of the profit that the producer makes. There's pros and cons to that for a landowner, and then there's flex, which is kind of a hybrid between those two, but we don't see that one quite as much. It's mostly crop share or fixed cash. And so we asked the demographic questions just so we can get an idea of who our average landowner is in Kansas, and they kind of hit the marks of previous studies. Around 68 and a half years old, about 74% of the respondents were male, kind of split between absentee and those that live within 25 miles of the land they lease on. Then we asked about your current leasing operations, so your longest leasing tenant that you have, so what's your average relationship with them. So most Kansas landowners, the average is 2 tenants per landowner, but we did have a max of somebody working with 25 different tenants. And then your relationship, your longest leasing relationship, is about 15 years in Kansas, with, again, the max being 75 years that a landowner has worked with a tenant or the tenant's family for that long. So a range, but we kind of see these averages are about what previous studies of Kansas have done as well. And then we asked some risk questions of just which lease type do you think is the most risky for a landowner? And so we did see that the crop share was perceived as more risky. Then we kind of dove into this young producers aspect of it and relationship, because what we see a lot of the times with leasing is relationship and this trust, how much you trust or don't trust somebody kind of comes into the relationship of it. So we asked them, how risky would you rank renting to a family member, to a stranger, to a neighbor, to a friend? And then we kind of added in this young producers concept of it with who just began farming, who has some experience, who has 10 years of experience, and then we kind of meshed those together and said, well, someone who just began farming but you know them, or you don't know them, or you know their family who might know them, because we see that a lot with Kansas landowners, of that word of mouth. And then the last part of the survey was an actual scenario where they were given 3 tenants. All of the tenants were 30 years old, and they were different attributes is what we call them, but different relationships. So either a stranger, an acquaintance, or family friend, and then no years of experience, 5 and 10 years of experience. So tenant, and then they had to choose between tenant A, B, and C at different prices and at different relationships. We don't quite have full results on that part yet, but we've got results on the rest of the survey of just how the risk attitudes, and so we kind of have this story to tell that we're hoping that the what we call willingness to pay or willingness to lease, those last scenarios, will you stick true to this story of that you do want to help young producers and not charge them more money, even though we see them as more risky? Do you hold true to that? It's kind of the purpose of this study, to see what landowners think and say and what they want out of a young producer, but then kind of put them to the test just a little.
You mentioned that a big part of your study seemed to be about how landlords interact with young producers. Why is leasing land so important to young producers?
A young producer is at a disadvantage. They don't have access to capital, which is why you see a lot of young producers going to 4-year universities and getting outside jobs to start off and having a larger portion of their income come from off-farm and then starting a small farm. They're at a disadvantage with that, and then they're at a disadvantage with just they don't have the years of experience. Even if you were born and raised on a farm or a ranch, that helps, but if you're somebody that truly grew up and you've had some experience but not a lot of tangible experience, it's hard to get your foot in the door. It's easier for a young producer to obtain economies of scale, which basically means we're scaling up more production to make more money, because if you're making more money with lower overhead, it just works out better. And so you see young producers use leasing as a way to get that, because when you've bought land, you have a large overhead yearly payment that has to be paid before anything else can get paid. Well, when you're leasing, that's much lower because you don't own that land. And so you see a lot of young producers that are using leasing, and they may lease 100% of the land they operate on when they first start off. And then as they gain more experience and more capital, things like that, they lease less. So leasing is kind of this first step into the door. And if we have Kansas landowners that will lease to young producers, it can help these young producers get established so that they can be successful both short run and long run.
From this survey, what conclusions did you draw from it?
The story we kind of tell from the survey at the beginning is that our data set seems to match previous ones of surveys done in Kansas. Our average age is about where we've seen before, number of tenants. What we get out of this is this story of landowners are saying they want to help young producers, and I do believe they do. And they say they can see that young producers are at a disadvantage, and they want to help. They do see them typically as more risky, especially if we don't know them or they don't know somebody who knows them. It's just kind of like more cautious than anything. But in the focus group, and based on some of the early results of our survey, it leans toward this story of like, we want to help them. We do think they're more risky, but not so risky we're going to charge them more money. You should be charged about the same as somebody else. I may ask more questions of you as a young producer. I may ask to meet with you to talk about what are your farming practices to make sure I trust you, but I'm not going to charge you more money. But then when we ask them a simple question that does a scenario between a 30-year-old is offering $100 an acre and a 60-year-old's offering $110 an acre, if that story is correct, you should answer the 30-year-old $100 an acre because we want to help them out. We're not going to just go with the one that pays more. And what we're kind of seeing is this story may not be holding true when it's put money to the test. I think it's something as far as extension goes can be very eye-opening to both landowners and young producers. Because a young producer, given the results of this study, we hope, can look at their area that they work in and maybe see, okay, the landowners in my area are kind of expecting me to present myself and prove myself, either through a resume with references or through me meeting with them and talking to them and saying, no, I am financially okay, to kind of gain that trust. Or maybe a landowner in a different part of the state just does require a few dollars more, but that's how I can be competitive and get this lease. Because not always, but a lot of the times once you get into a leasing scenario, once you've established a good reputation with the landowner, it can be a long-lasting relationship. And that's why landowners look at young producers as very viable tenants, because they see if they're good and I like them and we're all good, here's 30 more years, 40 more years that can be with this one family. And we do see that a lot of Kansas landowners like that stability and trust. And sometimes we'll take less money, but yeah, that's at the final parts of this survey where we've put it to the test is what I'm excited to see the true numbers on, of are you holding strong to this? And if you're not, why? Can we figure out a reason why? And then can we educate the young producers of like, okay, this is what landowners are wanting. And then can we go to the landowners and be like, why are you wanting this? Is there any way we can negotiate why? So it's kind of more education-based, but there's also, this survey won't quite give the policy implications, but it can help set a foundation of like this need of matching landowners to young producers. But we're kind of hoping it can also help lay the foundation for some future research of, will Kansas ever do a matching program like Nebraska? Is Nebraska's being successful? It's new, and I think it is based on what I've read, but will more Midwestern or heavy agricultural states start looking at things like this? And now that's a big stretch from my survey to that conclusion, but at the very least we've got some great education tools and perceptions and hopefully some eye-opening numbers by the end of it.
Absolutely. If people want to see and find more information about the survey you've done, where can they go? Ag Manager will be the quickest way to get to some of this information, but we also want to make sure it gets out there in extension publications and extension presentations. Thank you, Chelsea, for coming in and joining me today.
Yeah, thank you.
For more information on this topic, go to agmanager.info. She's Chelsea Arnold, a graduate researcher in agricultural economics at K-State. I'm Shelby Varner, and we will be back with more on Agriculture Today.
Coming to you from the campus of Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. Before we get to today's agricultural news headlines, we've learned this morning of the passing of a true icon in agricultural education and in the livestock industry here in Kansas. Miles McKee, Professor Emeritus at K-State, who served the Animal Sciences and Industry Department from 1959 through his retirement in 2005. Over those 46 years, he instructed and guided thousands of students in beef production and introductory animal science, and he was renowned for his academic advising, and simply one of the more gracious gentlemen that you could ever know. Miles was recognized as the first ever recipient of the Don Good Impact Award from the Animal Sciences and Industry Department in 2015 in ceremonies at the department's Family and Friends Reunion, at which he remarked about his relentless commitment to students.
Well, I looked on each student as an individual with their own problems or their own concerns, their own wishes. And I hoped that as I worked with them, I could help them achieve the one thing or two or three, whatever they might have as goals that they wanted to achieve. And so I loved the variety of students, I think we have the greatest group of students here at Kansas State. At least I got to work with the greatest group, and so I thank them all for being so kind.
Miles McKee, passing away yesterday at the age of 91. Our condolences to the McKee family and the legions of Miles's friends. In this week's Kansas Crop Progress and Condition Report out from the USDA for the week ending this past Sunday, our topsoil moisture in the state rated at 1% surplus, 45% adequate, and 54% short to very short. Subsoil moisture at 1% surplus and 50% adequate, 49% short to very short as of the past weekend. The condition of the Kansas corn crop, 54% good to excellent, 29% fair, and 17% poor to very poor. Corn in the dough stage now at 91%, in the dent at 63%, and corn now mature at 12%. Soybean conditions, 53% good to excellent, 34% fair, and 13% poor to very poor, with beans blooming at 94% and setting pods at 81%. The bean crop dropping leaves at 6% now. And the grain sorghum crop condition, 56% good to excellent, 32% fair, 12% poor to very poor. Sorghum now headed at 93%. Sorghum turning color, 48%, and sorghum now mature at 1%. Range and pasture conditions in the state, 39% good to excellent this week and 38% fair, 23% poor to very poor. For a look at the national crop conditions now, we turn to the USDA's Stephanie Ho.
Late summer rainfall across the upper Midwest had little overall impact on corn and soybean condition.
As we look at the corn condition for the week ending August 29th, no changes from last week. 60% of the crop rated good to excellent, 14% very poor to poor. That is below what we saw this time a year ago.
That was USDA meteorologist Brad Rippey.
Focusing in on those western Corn Belt states, we continue to see a considerable portion of the crop rated very poor to poor, led by North Dakota 47% and followed by South Dakota 45% and Minnesota at 27%.
He notes a similar picture for soybean condition with no change in the good to excellent ratings and a 1-point drop in the very poor to poor ratings.
This is quite a bit below the 2020 late August condition numbers when we saw 66% of the crop good to excellent, just 10% very poor to poor.
This is Stephanie Ho for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
And by the way, the grain sorghum condition nationally at 58% good to excellent, down 4% from the previous week. Now on to this week's edition of Milk Lines with K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk. Mike?
Today I want to visit with our Kansas dairy farmers concerning summertime leanness in their dairy herds. You know, one of the problems that we have during the summertime is just simply this. Our animals are spending too much time on their feet. There's a variety of reasons that occurs, but the big issue is the more time they spend standing, less time they spend in the freestall or laying down, that increases the stress on the hoof. And this is going to result in some issues you probably won't see yet for a couple of months, but there are several factors that are causing issues in your herd that you may not be experiencing today. So, let's take a look at the cows this afternoon. How many animals are standing? You know, a lot of times in the morning when we walk through the barn, they're laying down, but by afternoon they're standing. Why are they standing? Well, this could be a couple of things going on. Most likely reason they're standing is an increase in core body temperature. You see, as they're heat stressed and as their body temperature rises because they cannot dissipate all of the heat that they're generating, they tend to stand. And a lot of times this is about 102.5 degrees Fahrenheit. When their body temperature actually reaches that, they will stand because they're not able to dissipate enough heat while they lay down. So when they stand, they increase the surface area of their body that's actually exposed to whatever airflow there might be. This will actually increase the amount of heat that they can dissipate to the environment as compared to if they were laying down. Now, it's a really warm afternoon and you see some open mouth breathing. In other words, animals are starting to pant. They're going to stand because it's easier for them to breathe or pant when they're standing than it is when they're laying down. Another issue we have this time of year is flies. You know, our fly control may have kind of waned off during the summertime, and we have a buildup of flies. So those flies are pests and will cause the animals to stand, and more importantly, it will cause them to bunch. So if you're observing these sorts of things in your dairy herd, you need to probably try to do some things about the flies. That's the easiest thing to do. And there are many different things we can do that. Probably going to, at this point, require some chemical treatment to knock those flies down, but you're going to have to keep at it for several days because you probably have a huge supply of eggs laying around your farm. These are going to hatch, so it's going to be a 2 to 3 week process in order to actually control the flies. As far as the heat stress, well, that's a plan for probably next year. And if you have some fans that can be repaired or sprinkler systems that can be repaired, that would be helpful. But you may have to just plan for next year to try to do something about that in a meaningful way. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our dairy farmers to consider the damage that we're doing to hooves due to heat stress and flies this summer.
Thanks, Mike. And you're listening to Agriculture Today. Closing out this Agriculture Today, we welcome back in to talk wildlife management, former wildlife specialist with K-State Research and Extension, Charlie Lee. Charlie, you have a new report recently posted, and it gets at a question that's more prominent yet, how to contend with feral hogs and how hunting might affect their behavior. But let's discuss for a bit here the issue of wild pigs.
Well, wild boar and feral swine occur worldwide. They are native from Eurasia and from introduced populations. Both wild boar and feral swine belong to the same species, so typically we just call them wild pigs. And feral swine and wild boar are hybrids occasionally. In the last few decades, the number and the range of wild pigs have increased dramatically worldwide, except here in Kansas. And we'll discuss maybe some reasons for that a little bit later. But worldwide, that expansion is believed to include, because of the adaptability of wild pigs to a variety of different habitats. We have mild winters, reforestation efforts, increased availability of crops, supplementary feeding, and introductions of wild boars and feral swine from all continents except Antarctica. The increase is largely thought to be due to the fact that pigs have the highest reproductive rate among ungulates. Recreational hunters have been traditionally the main cause of mortality for wild pigs, but that number of recreational hunters has been declining in many countries, including the United States. The economic and environmental impacts of wild pigs is substantial. There's lots of different estimates, but the problems include vehicle collisions, transmission of diseases to wildlife, to livestock, and to people, damage to crops, predation on native species, changes in soil chemistry, destruction of wetlands, reducing plant and animal abundance, and typically they're thought to perhaps cause as many as $100 million only looking at 6 crops here in the United States annually.
They're an issue. That's quite plain, but you said that they're not as intense a problem here in Kansas?
Well, let's just say that Kansas was very proactive early on, before wild pigs were well established. Control of wild pigs here in Kansas has been largely the result of efforts by USDA Wildlife Services and the Kansas Department of Agriculture, who early on agreed to conduct a program. As you're well aware, wild pigs are not wildlife, so thus are not under the authority of the Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks. Since it is a form of domestic livestock, Department of Ag is looking for assistance. USDA Wildlife Services cooperated with them, funded some of their efforts early on, with some conditions, and one of those that would be that recreational hunting would be highly discouraged. So with the understanding that recreational hunting would make the job of eradication of wild pigs much more difficult, because hunting would cause the pigs to alter their behavior, perhaps go completely nocturnal, would break up larger groups into smaller groups, which would scatter and perhaps actually increase the population. It was thought that perhaps recreational hunters may not be as efficient as paid hunters, if you will, or an agency that's had their sole focus on eradication of wild pigs. Plus, when you look at the habitat in Kansas and you add in all of the means of types of control that's been done for wild pigs, Kansas doesn't have a lot of habitat in particularly the western half of the state. That's difficult for wild pigs to hide at all times of the year. There are times of the year that it's easy for feral hogs to hide in taller crops. They can hide in southeast Kansas in dense forested areas, particularly those that have lots of cedars. But Kansas isn't as densely forested, if you will, as many other states where pigs have better opportunity to hide than they do here in Kansas. So they've been fairly successful, been killing around 500 pigs a year. Doesn't seem to be reducing the number, but it's certainly not increasing, which is the increase is what's happening in most other states. In the last year of data that I looked at, which was on Wildlife Service's annual report in 2020, showed that they had 290 wild pigs that were trapped and 220 that were killed with the use of hunting and a helicopter. So as long as that number is and the effort continues to the same, you can use that as a trend index and say that Kansas pig numbers are relatively stable and very low compared to a state to the east, Missouri, with as many as 50,000 feral hogs, and many more than that to the south in Oklahoma and Texas.
Back to this question, though, and this research review of the impacts of hunting on feral hog behavior. What was the consensus of that?
Well, they looked at the data that was out there and agreed that 29 studies that mentioned the effects of recreational hunting on the behavior of feral hogs showed that recreational hunting could cause changes in home range size, habitat use, and duration. However, there was little agreement between studies on the size, direction, and duration of those types of effects. Very few studies provided details about the type and frequency of hunting, the number of hunters, or if dogs were included, didn't list the number of animals that were harvested or the presence of areas nearby that could serve as refugia. As wild pigs adapt to human disturbances, they need to do a little bit better job of documenting the effects and trying to chart whether recreational hunting really causes pigs to change behavior. When you looked at the data, was not evenly split, but there was considerable amount of disagreement that recreational hunting was a factor in increasing the number of feral hogs. But they do think that recreational hunting in the majority of studies affects their behavior, but it's not always consistent.
This is one of these wild animal problems that seems to persist, maybe not as amplified here in Kansas as other states, but nonetheless is problematic, and that is in some locations, the proliferation of feral swine. Charlie, appreciate the look at this once more. Former wildlife specialist with K-State Research and Extension, that's Charlie Lee. Our time's away once more. Thanks for tuning in. Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.